The Rules Committee will come to order. Good evening and welcome to the Rules Committee. We will be considering this evening two pieces of legislation, H.R. 5711 and H.R. 5982. Administration after administration, federal rule-making spikes during the last year of a president's term, particularly between Election Day and Inauguration Day. These, quote, midnight rules, end quote, often represent last-minute defiance of the people's will as outgoing administrations seek to entrench the last pieces of a partisan agenda. H.R. 5982 amends the Congressional Review Act to allow joint resolutions disapproving en bloc regulations submitted to Congress for review within 60 legislative days of the end of a presidential term. H.R. 5711, the other legislation under consideration today, prohibits the Secretary of the Treasury from authorizing certain transactions by a U.S. financial institution in connection with the export or re-export of a commercial passenger aircraft to the Islamic Republic of Iran. This package also includes the text of H.R. 5715, which prohibits direct and indirect XM financing for Iran. I want to thank Congressman Goodlatte for being here, and I assume that Congressman Johnson will be joining us. Without objection, anything you have in writing will be inserted into the record, and we look forward to your brief summary, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Hastings? No comments from our friends. So, Mr. Goodlatte, you are now recognized for your comments.
Without amendment on September 14, 2016. The need for this legislation is clear. As the Obama administration comes to a close, Americans' freedom and prosperity is once again threatened by one of the most abusive features of modern bureaucracy, midnight regulation. In administration after administration, including the Obama administration, rulemaking activity spikes as the clock on a president's time in office approaches the stroke of midnight. This is particularly true between Election Day and Inauguration Day, but it is also true even before then. These successive waves of midnight regulation present deeply troubling issues. First, because outgoing administrations are no longer accountable to the voters, they are much more prone to issue midnight regulations that fly in the face of the electoral mandate the voters just gave the new incoming administration. Second, waves of midnight rules can be hard for Congress or a new administration to check. As a new Congress and president begin their terms, both must be focused on implementing new priorities within the mandates given by the voters. That doesn't always leave time to focus on cleaning up the last acts of the departing administration. In addition, the Congressional Review Act currently allows Congress to disapprove of regulations, including midnight regulations, only one at a time. A wave of midnight regulations can easily overwhelm Congress's ability to use one rule at a time resolutions as an effective check. Finally, the rush by outgoing administrations to impose midnight rules before the clock strikes 12 inevitably leads to more poorly analyzed rules with lower quality and lower benefits. The Obama administration has imposed more runaway regulation than any other in memory, and its midnight rulemaking period is no exception. This administration has issued or plans to issue at least 180 midnight rules within the scope of this bill, including multiple billion-dollar rules and more than 20 major rules imposing $100 million or more in costs per year. It has been estimated that at least as many as $113 billion in new regulatory costs can be attributed to the final months of the Obama administration's rulemaking activity. America needs a solution that guards against midnight rulemaking. I applaud my judiciary colleague, Representative Issa, for introducing that solution. This bill offers a simple and powerful means to stop the problem of abusive midnight rules, allowing Congress to disapprove of any and all midnight regulations in one fell swoop by one en bloc disapproval resolution under the Congressional Review Act. Any outgoing administration, understanding that it has this sword of Damocles hanging over its head For the next Congress, use will surely hesitate much more before abusing midnight rules. Further, once enabled to dispatch of all improper midnight rules with one simple resolution, Congress and succeeding administrations would be free to focus more of their energies on the voters' new priorities rather than the mess left by midnight rules. So I would request that the Rules Committee grant an appropriate rule that allows for expeditious consideration of H.R. 5982. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Goodlatte. Mr. Johnson, you're usually here earlier, and I'll repeat, though, my comments that we'd be happy for your summary of your presentation, and then would be happy for you to submit your entire presentation for the record.
Well, I thank the chair lady for that admonition, and I would like to say to my colleagues.
Is your microphone on, Mr.?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
I'd like to say to my colleagues, welcome back and congratulations to those on the winning side. And so this bill, Madam Chairwoman, seems to be a kind of a leftover piece that perhaps is no longer politically necessary, since the next outgoing president will be President Trump. And the fact that the current outgoing president leaves with just a normal residual of administrative rules issued during the period when this particular legislation would be effective, final 60 legislative days of a president's term, with midnight. I mean, that's not midnight, that's like 6 months before his term ends. And so there's not going to be any kind of midnight or eve of leaving rulemaking by this administration, and I trust that there would be none of the Trump administration once it departs. But at any rate, this is yet another unfounded and reckless attempt to prevent the implementation of critical laws by federal agencies. H.R. 5982 would amend the Congressional Review Act to enable Congress to vacate numerous rules adopted during the final 60 legislative days of a president's term into a single vote on a joint resolution of disapproval. Alarmingly, once these rules have been invalidated through this process, the agency may not adopt a subsequent similar rule absent express authorization by Congress. Notwithstanding the bill's colorful title, H.R. 5982 does not simply apply to rules submitted during the lame duck period following an election. To set the record straight, this bill applies to every rule submitted to Congress within the final 60 legislative days of the session, and as the Nonpartisan Congressional Research Service has clarified, this would include rules submitted as early as May 2016. More than 6 months should be adequate time for Congress to consider the merits of economically significant rules, which often take years to finalize. Indeed, according to the Nonpartisan Administrative Conference of the United States, many of these rules adopted between an election and the inauguration of a new president involve relatively routine matters, not implicating new policy initiatives by the incumbent administrations, end quote. Public Citizen similarly found in a report issued earlier this year that rules adopted during the final months of an administration take 3.6 years on average to finalize. So they're not midnight rules sprung on an unsuspecting Congress or the American people. So in other words, Madam Chairman, this bill is a solution to a non-existent and undocumented problem. But according to my Republican colleagues, this legislation is necessary to combat politically driven midnight rules in the final days of an administration. They also say that the Obama administration's regulatory agenda has eroded job growth and economic prosperity. But far from it, under President Obama's leadership, we've seen one of the longest consecutive streaks of private sector job creation, 70 months now, the fastest growing middle class income ever, and more high quality and affordable health care for 20 million Americans, including working Americans. Recently, the Census Bureau released new data indicating that in 2015, the median household income grew at the fastest rate on record, while the poverty rate fell at a faster rate than at any point since 1968. New data from the American Community Survey likewise indicates that the number of uninsured Americans is declining in nearly every state. These metrics reflect a strong record of progress as federal agencies implement laws like the Dodd-Frank Act and the Affordable Care Act. If anything, Madam Chair, we need new laws to ensure corporate accountability and stronger enforcement of the laws already on the books. So in closing, I urge my colleagues to oppose this legislation and to make in order my colleagues' amendments to the bill, and with that, I'll yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. I appreciate it. I don't have any questions for our witnesses here today. Mr. Woodall, do you have any questions you'd like to ask?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just had one. Congratulations to my friend from Georgia. We represent Gwinnett County together, and no matter what you believe in Gwinnett County, you can find somebody who believes it with you, and I value that. You make a persuasive case about the 60 legislative days going back 6 months. You make a persuasive case about how long it takes to get through the regulatory process. My question to you is, when elections are elections about change, irrespective of who's in the White House and who's coming in to follow them, do you believe that the American people are advantaged by the implementation of a rule in December that's going to get repealed and rolled back and redone come February, if we have agreed, since it has to pass the Congress, has to be signed by the President? It would take the same number of voices in Congress and the White House to repeal it outright as it would to pass the HJ res to disapprove it. How are we as a nation advantaged by yanking the pendulum back and forth instead of preventing the rule from going into effect to begin with?
Well, I think that's a very good question to ask. I would respond by saying that the American people expect moderation, they expect continuity, they expect there to be gradual change in this country, be it towards the right or towards the left. There's a center. There's a center mass. And so the people in that center understand that we elect Congress people to 2-year terms. They expect us to work throughout that 2 years to do what they elected us to do. They elect a president for 4 years. They don't expect that president to lay down after 3 years and 6 months and shut the lights off and do nothing. So they expect Congress to do what it does, and the ebbs and flows of our legislative process is something that the American people have come to expect. And I believe that that is exactly what the process now provides for.
Well, let me ask the chairman, if we could pass this bill today and it could take us back to May of this past year.
May of this year.
May of this year, thank you for correcting me. May of this year, as the gentleman suggests. Does that also mean we could pass this in the fourth week of January 2017, and it would still take us back? Is the expectation of this legislation that it does govern regulations retroactively, or does it anticipate only covering regulations that come out tomorrow or the next day?
It's my understanding that whenever this is passed, it can have that effect as dictated by this language. This is simply solving a practical problem. We do not want to, with this new administration and new Congress, have to spend months of the new year dealing with 100, and I'm not saying all 180 of these rules are going to be rules that we're going to want to repeal, but let's say half of them were. That means 90 separate votes on separate bills to repeal regulations that were obviously piled up to take effect right at the end, at the midnight of this current administration. And the practical effect of that is to keep us from a new agenda, whereas this bill would allow us to pick the ones there that we can get consensus on, because we have to have a majority in the House and a majority in the Senate to pass this, and then sign and send it to the president. But we could do it in a much more reduced period of time.
Well, if my friends would concede that we have the votes to get this done in the House and the Senate, and the only thing that we're lacking is a presidential signature, I would just encourage my friends to think seriously about this. If we can do it come January or February on our own volition, it sure seems to do the American people a favor by beginning that coming together and sorting these things out today.
Well, if I could respond, you know, we've been through the regular course to a certain extent on this legislation. And there's no need for us to hasten the inevitable. And we'll be operating with a new Congress next year, new Senate, a new president. Those bodies deserve to weigh in on an important piece of legislation such as this that's going to impact us on into the future.
It was not lost on me, Mr. Johnson, that your statistic was that it takes on average 3.5 years for the president to get a regulation through the process. I would hope that we will turn our attention to why it takes that long to get the people's business done. If it's worth getting done, it's certainly worth getting done faster than that. I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Woodall. Mr. McGovern.
Yeah, I don't have any questions. I just would like to ask unanimous consent to insert on the record the statement of administration policy that says if the president were presented with this, he would veto it.
Without objection.
Thanks.
Dr. Burgess? No. Judge Hastings?
Chair. Chairman Goodlatte, you used a figure of maybe 1/2 of the rules would be rules that you would not agree with. What about the other 1/2 that you do agree with when you use an en bloc methodology? You would be throwing out some things that you agree with?
No, if I may.
Yes.
The House and the Senate would have to choose those regulations that they do not agree with and put them into an en bloc package. Everything else would continue on as the regulatory law of the land.
Okay, assume for the moment then that there are some life-saving measures within the framework of what you're talking about. That would be satisfactory in your view?
I think that the Congressional Review Act operates to address each regulation in that fashion. So I don't see that there would be any change in the responsibility Congress has to look at a regulation responsibly to determine whether or not it should be revoked. But if it is going to be revoked, I think that it is appropriate, if there's consensus to do so, to put them in an en bloc package and deal with them more expeditiously.
Well, I lift from the statement of the administration this paragraph, not as a question, but just to be underscore the record. The administration continues to be guided by the same rigorous practices and principles used to develop and review regulations that have been upheld throughout the entirety of this administration and previous administrations. On December 17th, the administrator of the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs reiterated, this is in the year 15, that the administration would maintain its normal review standards and instructed agencies to plan and prioritize its regulations in order to ensure an orderly review process during the final year of the administration. For these reasons, H.R. 5982 is intended to solve a problem that does not exist, and that's exactly the language that was used by the ranking member, Mr. Johnson, just a moment ago. Really what you'll be doing is throwing out rules without any careful analysis or reasoning as to whether such action is wise and in the best interest of the American people. Quite frankly, this bill is nothing more than a partisan attempt to delegitimize the president's final months in office. I also want to make it clear, I'll be saying this for the next 4 years, I guess. People define mandates according to their own dictates. I, like Mr. Johnson, congratulate the majority in winning the majority, but the popular vote went to the minority, so I guess we kind of have a dual mandate in some respects, because I don't think that we can ignore the fact that the minority or the opposition did receive the popular vote in the United States of America. It's kind of shameful for y'all to spend your time bamming up on Obama. He's out, you're in, let's see how that goes.
Thank you, Judge Hastings. Mr. Cole, do you have any questions? Okay. Mr. Byrne, no questions. Gentlemen, we appreciate very much your coming over and testifying on this important issue this afternoon. And there being no further questions, we don't need you to stay any longer. You're welcome to stay, but you don't need to.
Thank you, Madam Chairman.
If you'd like to suffer along with us, we want to welcome to the Rules Committee, let me see, the distinguished chairman of the Financial Services Committee and our distinguished colleague from the state of Washington, Mr. Heck, to testify on H.R. 5711, to prohibit the Secretary of the Treasury from authorizing certain transactions by U.S. financial institution in connection with the export or re-export of a commercial passenger aircraft to the Islamic Republic of Iran. Gentlemen, if the chairman were here, he would say, we welcome the summary of your remarks, and we welcome that we welcome your written statements to be put into the record. And I now recognize the distinguished gentleman from Texas, Mr. Henserling.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate the opportunity to appear before you today as we consider H.R. 5711, which joins provisions from two pieces of legislation reported by the Financial Services Committee, one sponsored by Congressman Huizenga of Michigan, the chairman of our subcommittee on monetary policy and trade, the other introduced by Congressman Roscoe of Illinois. Both these bills were co-sponsored by our Democrat colleague on the Financial Services Committee, Mr. Sherman of California, who has devoted significant time on U.S.-Iran relations, both as a member of our committee as well as a Foreign Affairs Committee member. As we know, President Obama concluded his nuclear agreement with Iran last year, formally referred to as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or JCPOA. Under that agreement, the administration agreed to authorize the export of civilian aircraft to Iran. For this to take effect, the Treasury Department's Office of Foreign Asset Control must issue licenses for the sale of any U.S.-built planes to Iran, as well as aircraft from foreign manufacturers with 10% or more of U.S. content. Like many of my colleagues in Congress, I believe the JCPOA was and is a flawed deal, but that is not why we are here today. What H.R. 5711 does is prohibit Treasury from authorizing U.S. financing, again, Madam Chair, U.S. financing for Iran to buy or lease these planes, financing that was not agreed to by the JCPOA. In September, the Treasury Department released its first licenses to Airbus and Boeing for up to 97 combined planes destined for Iran Air, the country's flagship state-owned carrier. Exceeding the scope of the JCPOA, these licenses authorize U.S. financial institutions, quote, to engage in all transactions necessary to provide financing or other financial services, unquote, provided they are related to the underlying aircraft. Madam Chair, I noted that the administration agreed to the export of, quote, civilian aircraft to Iran. Here's what the Ayatollahs in Iran Air understand by civilian purposes. In 2011, Iran Air was sanctioned by our Treasury Department for using its planes to transport warfighters and weapons of war on behalf of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, or IRGC. The airline was delisted this year as a concession for the nuclear deal, but Iran's behavior remains unchanged. According to research by the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, this airline, under the direction of the IRGC, continues to fly, quote, known weapons resupply routes to Syria, stoking a conflict that has already claimed an estimated 500,000 lives. Just last month, UNICEF confirmed 5 attacks on Syrian schools that killed more than 30 children. Also last month, Iran conducted military drills using Boeing planes that have been part of its Air Force fleet for many years. This is not surprising, as Boeing itself has boasted that its commercial jetliners, quote, make an ideal platform for a variety of military derivative aircraft, unquote. Madam Chair, U.S. banks extend credit by drawing on our deposits and investments. So, can we believe that we would let them use American savings accounts to help strengthen the military capabilities of a regime that our own State Department calls, quote, the world's foremost state sponsor of terrorism? It is equally appalling that we would want American banks exposed to a country that Treasury has classified as, quote, a jurisdiction of primary money laundering concern. If aircraft manufacturers want financing help, they can always seek that support abroad. By cutting off Iran from the U.S. financial system, a goal the administration has claimed it supports, H.R. 5711 would protect Americans' deposits from finding their way into terrorist hands. Here I'd note, Madam Chair, that when this prohibition was offered as a floor amendment to the Financial Services Appropriations Bill in July, it passed by voice vote. In addition, H.R. 5711 extends its protection to U.S. taxpayer dollars, codifying existing prohibitions on direct export-import bank assistance to Iran and reducing the risk of indirect financing that benefits the regime. The need for this legislation was underlined by recent reports that Dubai Aerospace, an XM customer, may help finance up to 17 Airbus jets that Tehran has ordered. Sitting on the Financial Services Committee are some of the XM's strongest Republican critics as well as its strongest supporters. It underlines how common sense this measure is that not a single one of them opposed the bill during markup. Madam Chair, again, we thank you for this committee considering the legislation. I look forward to the committee's questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hensling. Mr. Heck, you're recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I, too, appreciate very much the opportunity to come before the committee and speak in opposition to H.R. 5711. And I do so, frankly, because to pass it is to render us less safe. To pass this legislation is to render us less safe. As the committee knows, the sale of commercial aircraft to Iran and the provision of associated services is explicitly provided for in Annex 2 of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which we refer to as the Iran deal. This specific transaction has been carefully reviewed by the Department of Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control to place conditions that minimize risk that the aircraft would be diverted from legitimate civilian aviation purposes. Indeed, I will assert with certainty that if this legislation is to pass, the sale of the airplanes will be shifted from Boeing to Airbus. Now, just stop and apply common sense to what that means. It means the added-on associated services, eyes on the plane that are associated with parts replacement and maintenance will not be done by an American company. Therefore, the prospect that they will be converted into a military use substantially increases, not decreases. And in fact, if we look at the periodic reports of the International Atomic Energy Agency, Iran is complying with its obligations under the deal. And we should not do something that would violate our obligations and lead to the potential collapse of an agreement, which prevents Iran from obtaining nuclear weapons and enhances our own security. If the agreement collapses, Iran will be incentivized to develop nuclear weapons. We will be less safe. But what I really want to do this evening is focus on what I think are the key issues at stake with these two bills: American jobs and our broader economic competitiveness. If we apply the Department of Commerce's formula for calculating jobs supported by exports to the proposed $17.6 billion sale of Boeing aircraft to Iran, we see that this sale could support more than 105,000 family wage manufacturing jobs, the kind where you can buy a home, take annual vacations, have health care, and a secure retirement, and send your kid to college. We have a choice. Either we let a transaction, please hear this phrase, that is fully legal, fully compliant, and without scandal go forward and support American manufacturing, or we let other countries sell those planes to Iran and take that business and those jobs, because those planes will be purchased from someone. Proponents of this bill might say, well, this isn't meant to single out one company. It applies to both Boeing and its competitors. But in practice, it puts American companies at a disadvantage with their foreign competitors. We've previously talked about bills that would have barred Treasury from actually issuing an export license, and in that context, I raised concerns that European manufacturers, unlike U.S. companies, can restructure their supply chain to reduce the U.S. content below where they face review. But if this bill were to become law, European companies wouldn't even need to do that in order to avoid being subject to its provisions. It's easy for a European company to get financing from a European bank if U.S. banks can't participate in a transaction. It's a lot harder for American companies to do the same, particularly if we want them to reinvest that money here in the United States. You know, time and time again, I've heard my colleagues argue that the government should not pick winners and losers. And yet, here we are, singling out and interfering with a legitimate, fully compliant, fully legal, scandal-free business transaction that supports the kind of high-skilled family wage manufacturing jobs we need more of in this country. We are still down 2.5 million manufacturing jobs since the beginning of the Great Recession. On the other bill before the committee being folded in here, H.R. 5715, regarding Ex-Im bank financing, I can only say this isn't belts and suspenders. This is belts and suspenders and stapling your pants to your flesh. Because here's what's real. It is illegal for the Ex-Im to finance a deal to a nation that has been designated a terrorist sponsor, as has Iran. The Ex-Im Bank has said in writing, we're not going to do this deal. Boeing has said in writing, we're not going to do this deal. If this isn't redundant and completely unnecessary, I don't know what is. And oh, by the way, it doesn't have a quorum at the Ex-Im Bank. They can't approve deals of this size anyway. This is all particularly true when the parties to the aircraft transaction say they won't seek Ex-Im financing, as I have indicated. These bills present some of the starkest contrast I have seen during my time in Congress, between the demands of our economy and our national security and the demands of ideology. I urge you to oppose this legislation. And oh, by the way, just in the interest of efficiency of use of time, the President has just indicated that he's going to veto it. Let's not waste our time on this legislation. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Heck. Congressman Henserling, I'm going to recognize you in just a moment because I saw you taking notes in response to things that Mr. Heck was saying, so I want to give you a chance to respond to those. But I do have to say a couple of comments that Mr. Heck made that caught my attention, and I was doing my best to listen very attentively. Now, I can't say with certainty that the sun's going to rise tomorrow morning, but you have great certainty about what this bill is going to do, and I find that very interesting. I know you were here for part of the previous presentation, and I'm curious again to hear how, on the one hand, our colleagues on the other side of the aisle talk so much about the wonderful economy we have, and that you bring forth the fact that we are still down 2.5 million manufacturing jobs since the, quote, Great Recession began. So we do get mixed messages on it, on the economy. Mr. Henserling.
Not from me, Madam Chair.
No, I didn't say that. I didn't say that. Mr. Henserling, I think you may want to make some comments in response. I'd like to recognize you.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. A couple of different comments. Again, let's be very precise about what we're speaking about, and that is should the U.S. financial system be opened for these Iranian sales? Should U.S. taxpayers be on the hook? The language of the JCPOA is that this financing is permissive. It is not mandatory. That would be my first point. The second point, where is my good friend, the gentleman from Washington, indicates that somehow this may violate the spirit of the agreement, whatever his precise words were. I don't want to put words into his mouth. But early on, the president himself, President Obama, indicated the Iranians weren't living up to the spirit of the agreement. And if our only concern here is jobs for the U.S., I guess we could begin arms sales to the Assad regime in Syria. We could sell arms to North Korea, and I'm sure we could somehow make money. But you know what? Providing for the common defense is clearly the number one imperative that we have as a Congress, as a nation. So again, this is not interrupting the JCPOA. I wish it was, but it's not. But the question is, should taxpayers be on the hook? Should the U.S. financial system be open here? And it's fascinating to me that when we had a hearing on this, Madam Chair, the Democrats' own witness told our committee, quote, "There is substantial risk, as my colleagues have noted, of engaging business in Iran as a general matter and of engaging in this deal specifically." Early on, Madam Chair, the administration itself has said, quote, "The administration has not been and is not planning to grant Iran access to the U.S. financial system." So apparently they changed their mind, but it doesn't mean that the U.S. House of Representatives shouldn't be heard on this issue. With respect to XM financing, well, maybe it is belt and suspenders, but there are far worse sins than redundancy. And if it's an issue as important as, again, taxpayer backing for these sales, again, it was nowhere in the JCPOA that mandatorily the U.S. financial system had to be open or that U.S. taxpayers had to be on the hook. Those are the two matters that are paramount here. And I believe that the House needs to work its will and be heard on this issue, Madam Chair, and I thank you for the opportunity to speak.
Thank you very much for amplifying your comments from before. Congressman Cole.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. First, I want to go officially on record in favor of the change of my friend, the chairman's title from chairman to secretary. I don't have any say over that, and I'll be supportive of whoever the president-elect chooses, but I'm very glad to see my friend is amongst those being considered for something like that. It just says a lot about what kind of member you are and what you bring to this body and what I think you could bring to the entire country in any position you ever occupied. I mean that with all sincerity. I also want to just make a point quickly here, and I think my friend Mr. Heck would certainly agree with me. I have a lot of respect for Boeing, and I know my friend does too. And I'm very fortunate. I've got 2,200 jobs in my district that they provide. It's going to 3,000. They have major facilities. Nobody does as much to defend the United States of America as this great country, and we have no exporter that's as successful as this country. So it provides lots of jobs. I just want to make clear here, while we have a policy debate here, my friend Mr. Heck makes a very good point that I don't think anybody at Boeing would ever be in favor of anything they thought would jeopardize the security of the United States of America. I don't think they're that kind of company. And I'm not suggesting, by the way, my friend implied that. I know you didn't, but I just want to make that clear. I have a lot of faith in them. I do want to ask my friend, the chairman, to respond to one of the points Mr. Heck made, because it's a good point. Airbus also a great company. They have American jobs, but they're primarily, obviously, overseas. And there would be an alternative market for this, for comparable airplanes. Of course, not as good, but comparable. And that probably would be availed. And so, I think my friend made a good point on, look, I trust Boeing people to not be servicing planes that were used inappropriately or in violation. Now, my friend also makes a good point. Look, we use commercial airplanes for military purposes. We transport our own troops in times of emergency with commercial planes. The commercial fleet is a great military asset for the United States, and I'm sure other countries' commercial fleets are potential military assets for them. So, but I'd like him to respond. Are you concerned, or is there anything we could do to make sure they don't get this capability? Because I share my friend's concern about this regime. Look, it's killed hundreds of Americans and done it deliberately, and I detest the agreement that we made with them. I think it was a big-time mistake, but we're here, so I'd like to get my friend's response to that.
Well, I thank the gentleman, number one, for his kind comments. And number two, with respect to the specific question, I would make a couple of different arguments. As the gentleman agrees with me that the JCPOA was a great mistake, I'm not sure that we should necessarily compound that with U.S. taxpayer exposure. So we know what the general rule is. The general rule is that the U.S. financial system is not open to Iran. And the truth is, regardless of Boeing's best intentions, we don't know really what happens to these aircraft once they are released, particularly when it comes to, for example, the leasing and other third-party arrangements. But it could be that particularly when we look at where our national debt is, we don't necessarily know what Iran will do. Will they make good on their payments? So on the one hand, they're going to get the aircraft. I understand that under the JCPOA. But could that be compounded with what could be up to perhaps a $70 billion Iranian bailout, courtesy of the U.S. taxpayer, either through the financial system or through possible XM financing? So I understand the gentleman from Washington's argument, and it is not an invalid argument, but I would say there are other countervailing arguments as well. And I think the House should be heard on the question, again, do we wish to have all the risk attended with the Iranian financial system, with all of their money laundering, with being the largest state sponsor of terrorism? Do we really want to open the U.S. financial system to this, complete with potential taxpayer bailout? And I think the majority of the House would say no to that question. I think it's an important question. I hope that we're allowed to proceed with this legislation.
I want to give Mr. Hecht a chance to respond, but before I do, I want to agree with the gentleman that I do think this bears discussion on the floor. I really do. I think it's a really, really important issue. And the nature of this regime is such that I don't think you can say it's a normal partner, okay? It's not a partner at all to our country or to civilized behavior, in my view, in terms of how it's run and what it does. So, you know, regardless of, you guys both have tremendously good arguments to make and thoughtful, but I certainly would be very supportive of this going to the floor so the full body could weigh in on it, because I think it's important. It's a statement about what we believe, and while we had a chance to make, quote, a statement on the agreement itself that makes this even remotely possible, we didn't have a real chance to vote on it. It wasn't a real treaty, you know, and so we didn't, the normal votes didn't apply, and that disappointed me greatly, and that's why I don't put a lot of credence in what the administration has to say here, because they sort of got this through the back door. If they thought it was a really good case, they'd have taken it to the Senate of the United States as a normal agreement, and we'd had that. But I want to give my friend Mr. Hecht a chance to respond to anything, and again, commend him for the arguments he's made and make it very apparent, and not just because they're in my district, but this is a great company, great American company, has been for generations. And, you know, every time we've had to go to harm's way, and since there's been air power, Boeing has been a huge part of our response. And I just don't think there's anybody who cares more about the country and any company that's done more for it than this particular company. So with that, my friend.
Thank you, sir. Well, 2 points. The first of which is, by my count, I believe my good friend from Texas used the term taxpayer bailout 11 times. I have absolutely no idea where he's getting that phrase. The fact of the matter is this is talking about private financing, not about public financing, because as I indicated earlier, the XM is already prohibited, already said they won't do it. The company's already said they won't access it. And in any event, they don't have a quorum to effect it, even if they wanted to violate law. Secondly, I have to take issue as to what actually is contained in JCPOA as it relates to financing, because Annex 2, which specifically allows for the sale of aircraft, says also and associated services. And I'll read you from Annex 2, Mr. Cole. Associated services means any service, including technical assistance, training, insurance, reinsurance, brokering, transportation, or financial service. So the JCPOA does in fact allow for this. We are therefore, in fact, changing the terms of the JCPOA, which is why the administration has raised the red flag, as this is undercutting it. And again, I will get back to where I began, because while I spent the bulk of my time talking about jobs and the impact on the environment, I started out by saying, we pass this, we're less safe. If we repeal JCPOA or destroy it, we're less safe. If we allow Airbus to sell them these planes and not be monitored by American eyes, American hands, we will be less safe.
Okay, with that, I yield back, Madam Chairman. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Cole. Mr. McGovern.
Yeah, Madam Chair, if I neglected to do this, the previous bill, I wanted to ask unanimous consent to submit the statement of Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee of Texas on some amendments she offered to H.R. 5982. If we could.
Without objection.
And I want to ask unanimous consent to insert into the record, Mr. Heck referred to it, this statement of administration policy that says if the President were presented with H.R. 5711, he would veto the bill.
Without objection.
And, and I would, the gentleman from Texas said he hopes that the House will have an opportunity to be able to debate this on the floor. Well, let me remove any mystery. We are going to bring this to the floor because you guys are in charge. And you regularly bring bills to the floor that I think are a waste of time. I think this is a waste of time. And you regularly deny the minority the opportunity to bring amendments or any legislation that we think is important. And I guess that's your, you have the power to do that since you're in charge. But there's, this is coming to the floor, unfortunately, and we all know the outcome. And if people want to be heard, they can speak all they want, whether in this committee, to the C-SPAN cameras, to the 3 people that are watching this, or to on the House floor. But there's no mystery here. You're in charge. You can do whatever you want. And so understand this will be vetoed, and another exercise in doing things that don't matter when there are so many other things that we ought to be doing. So having said that, I yield back my time. I appreciate the opportunity to be recognized.
Thank you, Mr. McGovern. Mr. Woodall. No question. Dr. Burgess. Mr. Byrne. Well, gentlemen, we thank you very much, and please leave your statements for the record for the our wonderful stenographer, and thank you all very much for coming to be here. I would like to say for the record that I appreciate Mr. Cole bringing up the issue of the great company that Boeing is. I certainly agree with that, but I also agree with the chairman on the concerns about this bill. Well, I want to thank the committee for our, the chairman's back.
Chairman now being received a motion from the gentleman from Oklahoma.
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee grant H.R. 5711 to prohibit the Secretary of the Treasury from authorizing certain transactions by a U.S. financial institution in connection with the export or re-export of commercial passenger aircraft to the Islamic Republic of Iran, a structured rule. The rule provides 1 hour of debate equally divided and controlled by the chair and the ranking minority member of the Committee on Financial Services. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule provides that an amendment in the nature of a substitute consisting of the text of Rules Committee Print 114-66 shall be considered as adopted, and the bill as amended shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against provisions of the bill as amended. The rule makes in order only the further amendment printed in Part A of the Rules Committee report, if offered by a member designated in the report, which shall be considered as read, shall be debatable for the time specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by the proponent and an opponent, shall not be subject to amendment and shall not be subject to a demand for division of the question. The rule waives all points of order against the amendment printed in Part A of the report. The rule provides one motion to recommit with or without instructions. Section 2 of the rule provides for the consideration of H.R. 5982, the Midnight Rules Relief Act of 2016, under a structured rule. The rule provides 1 hour of general debate, equally divided and controlled by the chair and the ranking minority member in the Committee on the Judiciary. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule provides that the bill shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against provisions in the bill. The rule makes an order only the amendments printed in Part B of the Rules Committee report. Each such amendment may be offered only in the order printed in the report, may be offered only by a member designated in the report, shall be considered as read, shall be debatable for the time specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by the proponent and unopponent, shall not be subject to amendment, and shall not be subject to a demand for division of the question. The rule waives all points of order against the amendments printed in Part B of the report. The rule provides one motion to recommit with or without instructions. Section 3 of the rule provides that on any legislative day during the period from November 18, 2016 through November 28, 2016, the journal of the proceedings of the previous day shall be considered as approved, and the chair may at any time declare the House adjourned to meet at a date and time announced by the chair in declaring the adjournment. Finally, Section 4 of the rule provides that the Speaker may appoint members to perform the duties of the chair for the duration of the period addressed in Section 3.
You now heard the motion from the gentleman from Oklahoma. Thank you very much. Is there a
Yes.
discussion or amendment to that? Gentleman from Massachusetts recognized.
I have an amendment to the rule. I move the committee grant H.R. 5711 and H.R. 5982, each an open rule, so that all members have the opportunity to offer amendments to the bills on the floor.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. Any further discussion on the gentleman's amendment? Seeing none, the vote will now be on McGovern. Those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. No. Noes have it, noes have it. Is there any other amendment or discussion? Seeing none, I would now ask for the vote on the motion from the gentleman from Oklahoma. Those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no.
No.
The ayes have it, the ayes have it.
for a roll call?
Gentleman asked for a roll call vote.
Ms. Fox?
Aye.
Ms. Fox, aye. Mr. Cole? Aye. Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Woodall? Mr. Woodall, aye. Mr. Burgess? Mr. Burgess, aye. Mr. Stivers? Mr. Collins? Aye. Mr. Collins, aye. Mr. Byrne? Aye. Mr. Byrne, aye. Mr. Newhouse? Ms. Slaughter? Mr. McGovern?
No.
Mr. McGovern, no. Mr. Hastings? No. Mr. Hastings, no. Mr. Polis? Mr. Chairman?
Aye.
Mr. Chairman, aye.
Clerk will report the total.
7 yeas, 2 nays.
The motion passes. Accordingly, the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Collins, will be handling this for Republicans.
And Mrs. Slaughter from New York will.
Mrs. Slaughter from New York will be handling this. I want to thank the gentlewoman from North Carolina for sitting in my stead. I'm sorry I got here a little bit late. And I appreciate you, Virginia, doing this very much. Jim and Alcee, good to see you. We're back for what will be a very informative week for all of us. At this time, there are no additional meetings expected of the Rules Committee for the remainder of the week. Any further business from any member? Thank you very much. We've now completed our work. What amazing.